The rain had been falling for 3 hours before anyone offered to help her, and by the time the cowboy appeared at the edge of the road with his hat pulled low and his boots already soaked through, Alina Marsh had nearly made peace with the idea that she would simply drown standing upright on the outskirts of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878. She had arrived on the afternoon stage from Wichita with one carpet bag slung over her shoulder and a trunk the size of a small wardrobe roped to the back of the coach. The driver, a weathered man named Cletus who had not spoken more than 11 words to her during the entire journey, had cut the trunk loose and deposited it in the mud at the edge of the road, with the kind of indifference that only a man who had seen too many desperate people pass through a desperate town could manage. He had then climbed back onto his seat, snapped the reins, and left her standing there in the gathering rain with her trunk, her carpet bag, and the name of a boarding house written on a folded piece of paper that was already beginning to dissolve in her wet fingers. The paper read, Mrs. Hattie Colton, Colton House, Main Street, Caldwell. Alina had asked 2 men who hurried past with their collars turned up against the rain whether they knew the place. Both had pointed vaguely west and kept walking. A woman in a yellow dress had paused long enough to say that Main Street was about 3 miles up the road, past the creek crossing, and that Alina ought to have arranged for a wagon, as if this were obvious, as if Alina had somehow failed at the most basic logistics of arriving in a new town in a rainstorm, with all of her worldly possessions condensed into a single heavy trunk. The trunk contained her mother's quilts, her teaching certificates, a set of McGuffey readers she intended to use in the schoolroom she had been hired to establish, a tin of lavender soap, 3 dresses, 2 winter coats, her father's Bible, and a daguerreotype of her parents taken in Ohio in 1861, the year before her father had gone to fight in the war and come back a different man. Everything she owned and everything she cared about was in that trunk. It weighed, she estimated, approximately as much as a small horse. She had managed to drag it perhaps 30 feet through the mud when she heard footsteps behind her. "That is a considerable trunk for a considerable amount of rain," said a voice, low and unhurried, with a cadence that suggested the speaker was not in the habit of being in a hurry about anything. Alina turned around. He was tall, which she noticed first, and lean in the way that men who worked outdoors became lean, all of it purposeful and none of it accidental. He wore a canvas duster that had been dark brown before the rain got to it and was now simply wet, and his hat was a wide-brimmed affair that had seen considerable weather. His face was angular and sun-browned, with a jaw that carried a few days of stubble and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rainfall. He was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, she thought, which was close enough to her own 23 that she did not feel the particular discomfort she sometimes felt when older men spoke to her. "It is," she agreed, because there was no point in denying it. He looked at the trunk. He looked at her. He looked at the road stretching away into the rain ahead of them. He seemed to be making a calculation, and it did not appear to be a complicated one. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Colton House on Main Street," she said. "I am told it is approximately 3 miles. He picked up the trunk. He simply bent down, gripped the handles on either end, and lifted it as though it were a matter of modest inconvenience. He settled the weight and adjusted his grip and looked at her from under the brim of his sodden hat and said, 'Well then, 3 miles it is.'" She stood in the rain staring at him. "You cannot be serious," she said. "I am generally serious," he said. He began to walk. Alina looked at the space where her trunk had been sitting in the mud, and then at the man now carrying it as though it were filled with feathers, and she grabbed her carpet bag and hurried to keep up with his long stride. "I am Alina Marsh," she said. "Cade Rourke," he said without breaking stride. "Mr. Rourke, I feel I should point out that this trunk weighs an enormous amount." "I have noticed," he said, not unkindly, "and it is raining quite heavily. That also has not escaped my attention." She looked at him sideways. There was no irritation in his voice, no martyrdom, no performance of effort. He was simply carrying her trunk through the rain because it needed to be carried and he had decided to carry it, and he seemed prepared to discuss the weather and other observations along the way as if this were a perfectly ordinary afternoon stroll. "Is this not an inconvenience to you?" she asked. "It is no trouble at all," he said. She did not know what to do with this. In her experience, men who did things for women always wanted something acknowledged in return, some gratitude performed to a specific degree, some debt established. Cade Rourke did not appear to want anything at all. He carried her trunk and he walked through the rain, and he did not seem to require her to be impressed by this. She walked beside him, and the rain continued to fall. They crossed through the edges of what she supposed was the outskirts of town, past a livery stable that smelled of wet hay and horse, past a general store with its awning dripping in sheets, past a cluster of low wooden buildings that huddled together as though for warmth. A dog watched them from a covered porch with the philosophical calm of a creature that had decided the rain was someone else's problem. "What brings you to Caldwell?" Cade asked, after they had walked perhaps half a mile in companionable silence. "I have been hired to establish a school," Eleanor said. "The town's schoolroom burned down last spring, and the children have been without formal instruction since March. The county posted a notice looking for a qualified teacher, and I applied." He glanced at her. "You came all the way from Wichita to teach school." "From Ohio originally," she said. "I taught in a school in Columbus for 2 years, but the position was eliminated when enrollment declined. I saw the county notice and I thought," she paused, considering how much to say to a stranger, even a stranger carrying her entire life through the rain, "I thought it sounded like a place that needed something I could offer." "It does," he said. "There are 42 children in this county who have not had proper schooling in 7 months. Some of the families have been doing what they can, but it is not the same as having a real teacher." She looked at him with some surprise. "You know the number." "My nephew is among the 42, he said. "My sister Sarah's boy, James. He is 9 years old and he reads at the level of a child half his age because the schoolroom burned before he had really gotten started." Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, some resistance she had not realized she was carrying. This was why she had come, she reminded herself. Not for adventure, not for escape, though both of those motivations were somewhere in the mix if she was honest. She had come because somewhere there was a 9-year-old boy named James who needed to learn to read, and that was a thing she knew how to help with. "When the school is established," she said, "I would very much like James to be among the first students." Cade Rourke looked at her then, a full look, not the sideways glances he had been offering. The rain ran off the brim of his hat in a small stream. "I expect he will be," he said. They walked on. The creek crossing the woman in the yellow dress had mentioned turned out to be more eventful than anticipated. The rain had swelled the creek to a fast-moving ribbon of brown water that covered the wooden bridge planking by a good 2 inches. Cade paused at the edge and looked at it with the calm assessment of someone who had crossed difficult terrain before and expected to cross difficult terrain again. "I can manage," Eleanor said immediately, because she had been managing things her whole life and she was not about to stop. "I know you can," he said, "but the wood is slick and the current has gotten into the boards. If you step wrong you will go down." He shifted the trunk. "Hold the right side rail with both hands and take it slow. I will be right beside you." She wanted to argue. She did not argue. She gripped the rail with both hands and she walked across the flooded bridge with the water rushing cold over her shoes and the wood shifting slightly beneath her feet. And Cade walked beside her with her trunk in his arms, and his body angled slightly toward her in a way that she understood, without either of them saying a word about it, meant that he would drop the trunk and catch her before he let the water take her. They made it across. On the far bank, Eleanor looked down at her completely sodden shoes and then at the man beside her, who had not dropped her trunk and had crossed a flooded bridge in a rainstorm, as if this were the kind of thing one simply did. "Thank you," she said. "It is no trouble," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "Because I keep meaning it," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the rain. He was not handsome in any conventional or obvious way, she thought. He was something better than handsome. He was reliable-looking, which was a quality she had rarely encountered in a face and did not know quite what to do with. They walked the remaining mile and a half through steadily easing rain, and she learned that he had been running cattle in the county for 4 years, that he had come to Kansas from Texas after the trail drives, that he had built a small ranch 2 miles east of town with the money from 3 seasons of driving longhorns north along the Kishom Trail, and that he had decided he was done with the trail because the railroads were closing in and the open range was changing, and he wanted something that was his in a way that a cattle drive never was. She told him that she was the youngest of 3 children, that her father had died 5 years ago from injuries sustained in the war that had taken years to kill him slowly, that her mother had followed him 2 years after as if she had simply decided there was not much point in staying, and that her older brother Thomas had the family farm in Ohio, and her sister Margaret had married a minister in Pennsylvania, and that she herself had never quite fit into either of those lives. "What kind of life do you fit into?" Cade asked. It was such a direct question that she almost stopped walking. "I am not entirely sure yet," she said honestly. "But I think it involves a schoolroom and somewhere that still needs making." He nodded slowly. "Caldwell is still being made," he said. "That is the truth of it." Caldwell was still being made. She could see that. The town had the raw, provisional feeling of a place that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. It had sprung up as a cattle shipping point when the railroad had extended its line, and it had all the attendant chaos of a place where trail drives ended, and cowboys collected their wages and saloons did considerable business. But it also had families. It had churches and a general store and a newly organized town council and 42 children who needed a teacher. And Alina could see, in the bones of it, the shape of the place it was trying to become. Main Street materialized out of the rain, a broad, muddy thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings, and Cade walked her directly to Colton House, which was a 2-story frame building painted white with a covered porch and a sign above the door that had been weathered to near illegibility, but still clearly read the name. He set her trunk down on the covered porch with the careful precision of a man returning something valuable. "Mrs. Hattie Colton came to the door before Alina had even knocked, which suggested she had been watching from the window, and she was a stout woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that took in the scene on her porch with the speed and accuracy of a seasoned observer. "Lord above, you're both soaked to the bone," Mrs. Colton said. "Get inside, get inside." "I am just leaving the lady to your care," Cade said, pulling his hat brim with one hand. "Miss Marsh, I hope you will find Caldwell everything you came looking for." "Mr. Rourke," Alina said. She was aware of something she did not have a word for, some small reluctance that had no business existing given that she had known this man for exactly 3 miles. "Thank you, truly." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "It was no trouble at all," he said. And then he was gone back into the rain, his tall figure moving down the wet street with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Mrs. Colton watched him go and then looked at Alina with an expression that managed to be simultaneously knowing and innocent. "Cade Rourke carried your trunk," she said. 3 miles, Alina confirmed. "In the rain, Mrs. Colton made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh but contained elements of both. "Come inside, dear," she said. "I will put the kettle on and you will tell me everything, and then I will tell you a few things worth knowing about this town." The things Mrs. Colton told her, over strong tea and a plate of biscuits in the warm kitchen of Colton House, were the following. That Caldwell had a population of approximately 800 souls, that it sat on the Kansas Indian Territory border, and served as the last cattle shipping point on the Kishom Trail, that the trail drives brought considerable income and considerable trouble in roughly equal proportions, that the town had a marshal named Heck Thomas, who did his best with insufficient resources, and that Cade Rourke was one of the most respected men in the county, known for his honesty and his reliability, and his stubborn refusal to be anyone other than exactly who he was. "He has a fine ranch," Mrs. Colton said, with the casual precision of a woman dropping specific information for specific reasons. "Built it himself, mostly. Good land, good water. He has one hired man and a very large dog named Senator." "Why Senator?" Alina asked, because she could not help it. "Because, Cade says, the dog makes a great deal of noise, eats at public expense, and has never done anything useful." Mrs. Colton smiled. "He has a sense of humor, does Cade Rourke. You will find that it takes a moment to detect, but it is there." Alina dried by the fire and thought about gray-green eyes and 3 miles of rain, and told herself firmly that she had a schoolroom to establish and 42 children to teach, and that was the entirety of what she had come to Caldwell to do. She was wrong, of course, but she did not know that yet. The county schoolroom was a charred foundation and some salvaged lumber. The town council, which met in the back room of the general store on Tuesday evenings, had committed to rebuilding it, but the commitment had not yet translated into action, as commitments in small western towns sometimes did not. Alina attended the Tuesday council meeting 4 days after her arrival, still in the grip of the particular determination that had gotten her to Kansas in the first place. The council was composed of 6 men: the store owner, the town's only doctor, the minister of the Baptist church, a banker named Pryor who had the kind of soft hands that suggested he had never built anything, the marshal, and Cade Rourke. She had not known Cade would be on the council. She had not prepared herself to see him in the lamplight of a warm room where he was no longer carrying things through the rain, and therefore she could not focus on the logistics of the situation, and instead had to simply look at him, which she did not find comfortable because of what she noticed. He noticed her come in. Something in his posture changed, became more precise, more alert. He nodded at her, and she nodded back, and the meeting proceeded. She stated her case clearly and without apology. She needed a schoolroom. She needed it before the winter set in with full force, which gave them perhaps 6 weeks. She had a list of what was required in terms of lumber, windows, a stove, and basic furnishings, and she had calculated the cost to the nearest dollar. She laid the paper with the figures on the table and waited. The banker, Pryor, said that the funds were not quite there. He said it in the manner of men who use financial language to avoid commitment, speaking of fiscal quarters and budget allocations. The store owner said that he could donate some lumber from his back stock if others contributed labor. The minister said that the congregation could organize a building day. Marshal Heck Thomas said he had 2 deputies who could swing a hammer on their off days. Cade Rourke said nothing during this exchange. He was looking at the figures she had written down. When everyone else had finished speaking, he looked up. "I will cover whatever the fund is short," he said, "and I will provide the labor for the framing. My man Willis is a competent builder, and I can pull in 2 or 3 ranchers who owe me a day's work." Pryor made a sound of mild protest about private citizens bearing public costs. Cade looked at him with the mild, gray-green patience of a man who had decided this argument was not worth having at full volume. "Those are my sister's children without a schoolroom," he said. "I am not waiting on a budget cycle." The schoolroom was agreed upon for the following Saturday, weather permitting. Alina caught Cade after the meeting as he was pulling on his duster in the doorway. "Mr. Rourke," she said. He turned. In the lamplight from the store window, his face was all planes and shadows. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for what you said in there. The children need a school," he said. "That is a simple enough equation." "Simple equations are not always simple to act on," she said. Pryor was prepared to delay until spring. "Pryor delays everything until it becomes someone else's problem," Cade said, and there was a flash of something dry and precise in his voice that made her think of what Mrs. Colton had said about his hidden sense of humor. "The children will have their school before the first hard frost. I will see to it." She looked at him in the doorway of the general store on a cool Kansas evening with the stars beginning to appear between the clouds left over from the week's rain, and she thought that she had never in her life met a man who simply did things. He carried trunks. He funded schoolrooms. He spoke plainly and acted immediately and did not, as far as she could tell, require applause for any of it. "Why are you on the town council?" she asked. "I would not have expected it to be your natural inclination." He thought about this. "Because the people making decisions about this town will shape it for the next 50 years, he said. "And I intend to still be here in 50 years, so it matters what decisions get made now." She thought about that for a long time after he had ridden away. The building day for the schoolroom was on a clear Saturday in early October, with the sky the hard, bright blue of autumn in Kansas, and the air carrying the first real edge of coming cold. Alina arrived at the site at 7 in the morning and found Cade Rourke already there, along with his hired man Willis, who was a quiet, capable man of about 40 who communicated primarily through nods, and 3 other ranchers whose names she gradually learned over the course of the day. Pugh Hanlon, who was Irish and talkative. Solomon Reed, who was a black rancher who had come to Kansas after the war and built a cattle operation that Cade spoke of with unconcealed respect. And a younger man named Danny Briggs, who seemed to have come mostly to be useful and had succeeded comprehensively at this. The minister had organized a congregation work party that arrived at 8 with additional lumber and 2 women carrying food for the midday meal. 6 of the town's women came with the explicit purpose of helping raise the school, and they worked alongside the men without discussion or ceremony, because there was simply too much to do to stand on ceremony. Alina found herself working beside Solomon Reed for much of the morning, helping to pass materials and hold boards as he and Willis nailed them into place, and she learned that Solomon had a daughter named Clara who was 8 years old and had not been to school since March and who, Solomon said, could already read better than most children twice her age. "She reads everything she can get hold of," he said. "I caught her reading the feed store catalog last week like it was a work of literature." "A good reader will read anything," Alina said, and smiled. "Clara sounds like exactly the kind of student who makes teaching worthwhile." Solomon looked at her with a measuring expression and then seemed to decide she passed whatever test he had been applying. "She will be glad to have a real teacher," he said. "We have all been waiting for this." By midday the walls were up and the rafters were going in, and the women who had come with food laid out a meal on planks set across sawhorses, and everyone ate together in the October sunshine. Alina sat on a section of lumber and ate cornbread and cold chicken, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, some sensation that took her several minutes to identify as belonging. Cade sat down beside her. Not next to her in any pointed or deliberate way, but simply because the section of lumber she was sitting on was long enough for 2 people, and he had been on his feet since before dawn and needed to sit. He had taken his hat off and his dark hair was damp with sweat, and there was sawdust on his forearms. "It is coming along well," she said. "Willis knows what he is doing," Cade said. "We will have the roof on by late afternoon and the stove installed by end of next week." "I can start teaching by the week after," she said. He looked at her. "You have your lesson plans ready already." "I have been planning lessons since Wichita," she said. "On the stage." "I had 6 hours with nothing else to do." Something moved across his face. She had been learning to read that face, which was not a face that announced its contents readily, and what she read there was something between admiration and amusement, a combination that she found she liked very much. "You take your work seriously," he said. "It is serious work," she said. "The years between 6 and 12 are when the foundations of a child's education are built. Everything after rests on what happens in those years. If I do not give James the tools he needs now, the gap only grows harder to close." Cade was quiet for a moment. "He is a smart boy," he said. "James, he thinks about everything. But he has been told by a couple of people that he is slow because he struggles with reading, and he has started to believe it." Alina felt the familiar, particular anger that rose in her whenever she encountered this particular cruelty, the way people misread struggle as inadequacy. "He is not slow," she said, with a conviction that surprised even her given that she had not yet met the child. "He simply has not yet had the right instruction. When he can read, you will see how quick he is." Cade looked at her for a moment. "I believe you," he said, and his voice had that quality it sometimes had, simple and direct, like something that had been stripped of all the unnecessary weight. The stove was installed that Wednesday by a man from town who specialized in such things, and Alina spent Thursday arranging the salvaged and donated furnishings. 6 long tables and a collection of mismatched chairs and 2 blackboards that the store owner had ordered from a catalog. And on Monday the 17th of October, 1878, she opened the doors of the new Caldwell County schoolroom and found 34 children waiting for her, which was 34 more than 0. And she considered it a magnificent beginning. James Rourke was among them. He was a small, serious boy with his uncle's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and he sat in the second row and watched Alina with the careful attention of someone who had been hurt before and was not sure yet whether this would be different. She did not treat him as a problem to be solved. She treated him as a person with something worth learning, which was different. She found within the first week that he had a remarkable memory and could hold long strings of information in his head with perfect fidelity, and she built his reading instruction around this strength, giving him patterns and sequences to memorize, and then showing him how the patterns connected to the words on the page. By the 3rd week, he read a full sentence aloud in class, and the look on his face was one that Alina carried with her for the rest of her life. Cade came to collect James from school most Fridays when his ranch work allowed. Alina noticed this. She noticed it in the way she had begun to notice many things about Cade Rourke, with a specificity that she would have applied the word professional curiosity to if she had been willing to be dishonest with herself. He would stand at the door of the schoolroom and wait, hat in hand, while she finished the day's lesson, and James would gather his things and run to his uncle with the uncomplicated joy of a child who knows he is loved. And Cade would listen while James told him everything that had happened that day, with the serious attention of someone for whom the information actually mattered. One Friday in early November he waited until all the children had gone and then came to the door and said, "Miss Marsh, I wonder if you might have a moment." She was erasing the blackboard. She turned around. "Of course." He came into the room and held his hat in both hands and looked at her with the directness that she had learned, simply how he was. "I wanted to tell you what James said to his mother last night." "What did he say?" "He said," Cade paused, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen before, something soft and slightly undone, the way a person's face looks when they are describing something that got past their defenses. He said, "Mama, I think I understand what words are for now," just exactly like that. "I think I understand what words are for now." Alina set down her eraser. For a moment she could not speak, and she did not try to. "My sister cried," Cade said. "I am not ashamed to say that I found something requiring my immediate attention in the other direction." Alina laughed, and it came out unsteadied, tilted slightly by emotion. "That is the finest thing anyone has said to me about my teaching," she said. "In 3 years of teaching school." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted you to know," he said, "because you did that. You came here in the rain with your enormous trunk and you decided to give my nephew the thing he needed most, and that matters. I wanted you to know that it matters." She held his gaze for a moment too long, or perhaps exactly long enough, and then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Rourke." "Cade," he said. It was the first time he had offered this, and she understood that it was not a small thing. "Thank you, Cade," she said. He turned his hat in his hands once more, the way he did when he was deciding something. "There is a social at the Baptist church this Saturday," he said. "Mrs. Colton and most of the town will be there. I wondered if you might save me a dance." She had not been to any of Caldwell's social events since her arrival, because she had been busy with the school, and because she had not been sure of her reception in a cattle town that had not previously expected much in the way of culture. She had also been busy telling herself that Cade Rourke was simply a kind man who had carried her trunk and helped fund the school, and that she should not read anything further into his attentions. "I would be happy to save you a dance," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without reserve, and it changed his face in a way that she found entirely unreasonable. It was not fair, she thought, that a person who was already so competent and so honest should also have a smile like that. He put his hat back on and said good night and collected James from where the boy had been waiting patiently in the doorway, and they walked away together down the November street, the tall man and the small boy, James talking with both hands and Cade listening with his whole attention, and Alina stood in the doorway of the schoolroom she had built and thought that she was in an enormous amount of trouble. The church social was on Saturday evening, and Alina wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that she had made herself in Ohio, and which had not entirely survived the ravages of the trunk and the rain but had been carefully pressed by Mrs. Colton with an iron she heated in the kitchen fire. Mrs. Colton had also, apparently coincidentally, mentioned to Alina 3 times during the day that Cade Rourke was a man of singular character and excellent land. The social was held in the church fellowship hall, which had been cleared of its usual furnishings and decorated with late-autumn flowers and paper lanterns, and there was a fiddle player named Old Pete, who claimed to have played for every president since Buchanan and was believed by no one but loved by everyone. The music was lively, and the room was warm, and Alina was introduced to more people in 2 hours than she had met in the previous month combined. She met Sarah Rourke, Cade's sister, who was a pretty woman of 30 with her brother's directness and her son's gray-green eyes, and who took Alina's hands in both of hers and said simply, "You have given my boy himself. I will never forget that." She met Solomon Reed's wife, a dignified and beautiful woman named Margaret who had the kind of quiet authority that came from having built something real in difficult circumstances, and their daughter Clara, who was indeed a reader of extraordinary natural talent, and who spent 5 minutes telling Alina about a book she had found in the back of the general store before her parents gently redirected her toward the dance floor. She danced twice with Pugh Hanlon, who was a spirited dancer with a great deal of opinions about cattle prices, and once with the minister, who was a kind, earnest man named Reverend Briggs, who danced with the careful precision of someone following written instructions. And then Cade appeared at her elbow. He had cleaned up considerably from the sawdust and work-worn version of himself she had been seeing. He was wearing a dark vest over a white shirt, and he had shaved, and his dark hair was combed, and he held out his hand with the quiet confidence of a man who was not performing anything. She took his hand. He was a good dancer. She had not expected this, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected, and her surprise must have shown because the corner of his mouth moved. "Trail drives," he said by way of explanation. "Long evenings at camp, someone always had a fiddle. They danced through one song, and then Old Pete transitioned into something slower, and Cade kept hold of her hand in a way that was a question, and she did not pull away, which was an answer. 'You have settled in well,' he said. "Caldwell is easier to settle into than I expected," she said honestly. "The people here most of them are good." "Most," he agreed. There was the dry humor again, quick and precise. "The town council is improving," she said, and he laughed, which was also a thing she had not seen before, real laughter, uncalculated, and it undid something in her chest in a way she had stopped pretending was not happening. "I have been thinking," he said more quietly as they moved through the slower dance. "About what?" "About a number of things," he said. "About whether it would be completely inappropriate for me to ask whether you might be willing to take a ride some afternoon, when you have a free afternoon. Which may not be often." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she could now read with some confidence. careful honesty, with something uncertain behind it, which was the same thing she was feeling and which was strange to see on a face she had associated entirely with certainty. "It would not be inappropriate," she said. "Sunday afternoons," he said. "The school does not operate on Sundays." "No," she said, "it does not." "There is a part of the county I think you would find interesting," he said. "If you are the kind of person who finds geography interesting." "I am exactly that kind of person," she said. He smiled at her again, and she felt it the whole way down to the soles of her feet. They rode out that first Sunday on a clear November afternoon, with the prairie grass gone gold, and the sky impossibly wide above it. Cade had brought a horse for her from his ranch, a steady bay mare named Pearl who had excellent manners and a forgiving disposition. They rode east from town along a trail that wound up through low hills, and then opened suddenly onto a high bluff that looked out over a valley where a creek ran silver between banks of cottonwoods, their leaves gone to pure gold in the autumn light. Alina pulled Pearl to a stop and simply looked. "I thought you would like this," Cade said from beside her. "Cade," she said, "this is extraordinary." "On clear days you can see 20 miles south into the territory," he said. "My ranch is just below on the near side of the creek. You can see the roof from here." She looked where he was indicating and saw, in the valley below, a low stone ranch house with a good-sized barn and some outbuildings, and she could see from this distance that it had been built with care, that it sat in the landscape as though it belonged there rather than having been imposed upon it. "You built that," she said. "Willis helped," he said. "The stone was on the property. I did not have to haul it far. It looks permanent," she said, "like it intends to be there for a long time." "That was the intention," he said. They sat on their horses on the bluff for a while longer, not saying much, and Alina thought about permanence and intention and what it meant to build a thing that was yours. She had been building things her whole life, small and portable things, skills and knowledge, and the careful architecture of her independence, because she had never had a place that was stable enough to build anything larger. Her father's illness, her mother's grief, the impermanence of a teaching position in a city that did not know what to do with an unmarried woman of ambition. She had learned to travel light except for the things in the trunk, the quilts and the books and the daguerreotype, which were the things she could not leave behind because they were the only evidence of a past that had belonged to her. She was thinking all of this and not saying any of it, and then Cade said very quietly, "Are you planning to stay?" She turned to look at him. "In Caldwell?" "Yes," he said. He was looking out over the valley. "Some teachers come for a year and then go back east." "I am not asking as criticism. I am asking because it matters." "Why does it matter?" she said. He turned to look at her then, and his gray-green eyes were entirely direct. "Because I would like to know whether there is any point in what I am doing." She held his gaze for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods in the valley below. The autumn light lay over everything like something warm and final. "I am planning to stay," she said, and she knew as she said it that she meant it in more ways than one. That this bluff and this valley and this man had somehow, in the space of 6 weeks, gotten past the careful portable architecture of her independence and lodged themselves somewhere deeper, somewhere that she recognized as the place where decisions that could not be unmade were made. "Good," he said. And then, with the economy of a man who chose words carefully because they meant something, he said nothing else at all, but he put his horse a little closer to hers on the bluff, and they looked out over the valley together until the light began to shift toward afternoon. They rode down from the bluff and he showed her the ranch. This was, she understood, a significant thing. He introduced her to Willis, who nodded with what she had come to recognize as his version of enthusiasm, and to Senator the dog, who turned out to be a massive, gray-muzzled old hound of some indeterminate ancestry, who investigated Alina thoroughly and then sat on her foot, which Willis assured her was a sign of profound approval. The ranch house was 3 rooms, stone-walled and sturdy, with a wooden floor that Cade had laid himself, and a fireplace that took up most of one wall, and a kitchen that had been equipped with serious thought about what a kitchen actually needed. There were bookshelves. This surprised her enough that she stopped and looked at them for a moment. "You read," she said. "I read," he confirmed, and there was something slightly defensive in his voice, as if he expected her to be surprised in a condescending way. She made sure she was not. She looked at the titles, history primarily, some natural philosophy, a battered copy of a Shakespeare collected works that had clearly been read many times, a legal text, an agricultural manual, and tucked slightly behind the others as if it had been shelved with some embarrassment, a collection of poems. She pulled out the poetry collection and looked at the cover. He cleared his throat. "A gift from my mother," he said, "when I left Texas." "Do you like it?" she asked. A pause. "Some of it," he said. She put it back carefully in its place and turned around and found him watching her with an expression she had come to understand was his version of vulnerability, the face he wore when something mattered more than he wanted to admit. "I think it is the finest thing in the house," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Would you like some coffee?" They had coffee in front of the fireplace in the fading afternoon light, and they talked for 2 hours. The kind of talking that happens when two people discover that the space between them is smaller than either had understood. When the conversation stops being about things and starts being about ideas and beliefs, and the interior country that people rarely show anyone. She told him about her mother's quilts and what it had been like to watch her mother make beauty out of scraps that had nothing else to recommend them. He told her about the Kishom Trail and what it had taught him about the difference between things that looked solid and things that actually were, about how a river that appeared crossable could take a man and his horse in 30 seconds, and about how that reality, encountered honestly, changed the way you moved through the world. He rode her back to town as the last light was going and stopped his horse in front of Colton House and looked at her with the particular careful attention of a man about to say something precise. "Next Sunday," he said. "Next Sunday," she agreed. She went inside and found Mrs. Colton sitting in the parlor with her mending, looking entirely unsurprised. "Well," said Mrs. Colton. "Good night, Mrs. Colton," said Alina, and went upstairs and sat in her room in the dark and thought about stone houses and bookshelves, and the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have understood something new. The Sunday rides became a fixture of Alina's life in Caldwell through November and into December, a fact that was noted by the town with the thorough, comprehensive attention that small towns bring to bear on romantic developments. Mrs. Colton mentioned it with the satisfied precision of someone whose prediction is coming true. Hugh Hanlon told Cade at a cattle meeting that he had better act before someone else did, a suggestion that Cade received with the expression of a man who would address things in his own time. Solomon Reed simply said to Alina, during a Tuesday afternoon school visit to observe Clara's progress, that Cade Rourke was a man who took his time with important decisions, but had never been wrong when he finally made one. Alina registered all of this and continued teaching school 5 days a week, and riding with Cade on Sundays, and attending the Tuesday council meetings, where she had taken on the unofficial but completely accepted role of advocate for the school's continued funding, a role she occupied with the combination of detailed preparation and refusal to be diverted by financial evasion that she had developed over 3 years of dealing with school boards. The teaching itself was the center of everything. James Rourke read his first full chapter of a McGuffey reader aloud to the class in November, and the class applauded with the unself-conscious generosity of children who have not yet learned to be jealous of each other's victories. Clara Reed was reading at a level that Alina began privately to think might require sending away for more advanced texts. 2 brothers named Marcus and Edward Hanlon, Pugh's boys, turned out to have a gift for mathematics that delighted Alina and slightly alarmed their father. A girl named Lucy Chen, whose father ran the laundry and who had faced more than her share of ignorant cruelty from some corners of the town, proved to have a natural talent for drawing and penmanship that Alina praised loudly and specifically in ways that were designed to make a point about what talent looked like and where it lived. She was aware of the injustices embedded in the world these children inhabited. She saw how Solomon Reed's family navigated the casual brutality of a Kansas cattle town that was not always consistent in its welcome of black families, how Lucy's father kept his eyes down when certain men of the town passed his door, how the children of Cherokee and Osage families who lived along the border were largely invisible to the town's official institutions. She could not fix these things. She could not erase the structural cruelties of the West in 1878 with a blackboard and a set of McGuffey readers. But she could make her schoolroom a place where a child's worth was determined by nothing except what they brought to the act of learning, and she did this with consistent, unyielding intentionality. Cade saw this. She knew he saw it because he mentioned it one Sunday as they rode along the creek, not with the effusion of praise but in his particular way, the way of a man who notices what is accurate and says so because accuracy is important. "You treat all of them the same," he said. "Solomon's Clara and the Hanlon boys and Lucy Chen and the rest. You do not make some of them feel that they are there by exception. They are not there by exception," she said. "They are there because they are children who need to learn. That is the only relevant fact." He was quiet for a moment. "Not everyone in this town agrees with that," he said. "I know," she said. "I have had 3 conversations with Pryor in the past month about whether the school's resources are being appropriately allocated. He means that he does not think Solomon Reed's daughter should sit in the same room as his daughter. I have explained to him 3 times, using the most precise language I can manage, that I will teach every child in this county who comes to my door, and that the school board can find another teacher if they feel otherwise, knowing full well that they cannot." Cade rode beside her. "Has he backed down?" "He has retreated to making pointed comments rather than explicit demands," she said, "which I count as sufficient progress for now." "I can speak to him," Cade said. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I think it is more effective if I fight this particular battle myself. If you intervene, it becomes a conflict between men of the town council. If I hold the line, it remains a matter of my professional authority over my own schoolroom." He looked at her. "You have thought about this carefully." "I think about most things carefully," she said. "I know," he said. And there it was again in his voice. That thing she had no exact word for. The specific kind of regard that is more than admiration but more careful than love. The thing that comes just before love when both people are being honest. December came in hard. The first week brought a snowstorm that closed school for 3 days and left Caldwell buried under 16 inches of white that turned the mud of Main Street into something that could have been beautiful if it had not also been extremely inconvenient. Alina kept the school stove well stocked, and the children came every day the weather allowed, bundled into everything they owned. Cade appeared at the school on the Thursday after the storm with a wagon load of additional firewood, which he and Willis stacked against the back wall of the schoolroom, in the manner of men who have done this kind of thing before, and know how to do it efficiently. Alina watched from the doorway as the children clustered around the wagon with the fascinated attention children give to any arriving thing, and James climbed up on the wagon seat beside his uncle, and chattered about something with the complete absence of self-consciousness that indicated he had decided, at 9 years old, that his uncle was his closest friend. She went out to thank Cade. He was loading the last of the wood with his back to her, and he turned when he heard her footsteps in the snow, and the cold had put color in his face, and his breath made small clouds in the air, and she thought with the clarity of a thought that arrives completely formed, all at once, without any preparatory stages. "I love this man." It arrived not like a question but like the answer to one she had been asking for a long time without being entirely sure what the question was. She stood in the snow outside her schoolroom and loved him, and did not say a word about it because they were surrounded by children and the moment was not for that, but she felt it settle through her like something solid and undeniable, like the stone foundations of a house built for permanence. "Thank you," she said, "for the wood. The stove you have is fine for mild weather," he said. "But if January comes in the way it usually does in Kansas, you will want more fuel than you think." "Then I will be grateful to have it," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the cold, bright air, and she wondered if something of what she was feeling showed in her face, and she thought from the change in his expression that perhaps it did. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at the valley from the bluff, like something he had decided to claim. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she said. On that Sunday he drove her in the wagon instead of riding, because the snow made horseback less comfortable, and they went out to the bluff, and the valley was entirely white below them, and the creek was a dark line through the snow, and the stone ranch house sat in the valley with smoke rising from its chimney in the still air, and Alina thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I have been thinking," Cade said. She had been finding that these words from him always preceded something significant. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, a long, considered quiet. "I have been thinking that I would like to ask you something," he said. "And I have been trying to determine the right moment and the right words, and I have concluded that I am not going to find a moment or words that are better than right now in plain language." She waited. He turned to look at her. In the wagon, in the December cold, on the bluff above his valley, he looked at her with complete directness. "I would very much like to marry you, Alina," he said. "If you are willing. I know I should wait longer. I know we have only known each other 2 months. But I am not a man who confuses himself about what he wants when he is sure of it, and I am sure of this." She had known it was coming. She had known it in the way that she had known the thing about loving him, as a completed fact rather than a possibility. She had been living with the knowledge of it for weeks, turning it over in her thinking, looking at it from every angle with the careful honesty she applied to important decisions. "You are proposing in a wagon in the snow," she said. "I am," he said. "I recognize this is not. I think it is perfect," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I am willing, very willing." He reached across the wagon seat and took her hand, and she felt the warmth of it through her glove, and he held her hand in the December cold above his valley and looked at her with that expression she had learned to read, the one that was the truest version of his face, and said, "Good." "Good," she agreed. And then he kissed her, which was the first time, careful and warm in the cold air, and she thought that she was not going to be traveling light anymore. She was going to put down roots. She was going to build something permanent. They were married on the 22nd of February, 1879, in the Baptist church in Caldwell, on a day that was clear and cold with the first suggestion of approaching spring in the light, if not yet in the temperature. Reverend Briggs officiated with a sincerity that made Alina glad she had been attended to his Sunday services with more regularity than she might otherwise have managed. Mrs. Colton cried with the thoroughness of a woman who feels that her investment in an outcome has been fully vindicated. Solomon and Margaret Reed sat in the third pew, and Clara sat beside her mother with her hands folded, and her expression serious with the gravity of witnessing something important. Old Pete played the fiddle so beautifully at the reception afterward that even Pryor, who was present because small towns operate on the principle that everyone comes to everyone's celebrations regardless of personal feelings, was moved to acknowledge that it was a fine sound. James Rourke served as the ring bearer, a role he discharged with intense 9-year-old seriousness, and Sarah Rourke stood beside Alina as her matron of honor and whispered, at the moment before Alina walked into the church, "You have no idea how good this is going to be." And she said it with the certainty of someone who actually knows. Cade stood at the front of the church and watched Alina come toward him, and she saw in his face the thing that she had been learning to read, all of it there at once, everything he was and everything he felt, without reservation or concealment, and she walked toward him through the February light, and thought that this was the best thing she had ever walked toward in her life. They spoke their vows clearly and without stumbling, because they had both chosen these words carefully and meant every syllable. The reception was in the church fellowship hall, and there was music and food, and every person in Caldwell who meant anything to Alina or to Cade, which turned out to be most of the town. And old Pete played until he claimed his arm was giving out, which everyone knew was not true, but which they allowed him because he was 83 and had earned certain courtesies. Alina danced with Cade in the fellowship hall where they had first danced 4 months ago, and it was the same old Pete and the same fiddle, but everything else was different. Everything was more settled and more certain, like a landscape after the last snow has melted and revealed what the land actually is. "Any regrets?" Cade said. "About marrying you," she said. "Let me think." She paused for approximately 1 second. "No, about leaving Ohio. I left Ohio because it did not need what I had to offer," she said. "Caldwell needed it," and she looked at him. "I needed Caldwell." He pulled her slightly closer in the dance. "I am glad you came," he said, "in the rain with your enormous trunk." "I am glad you were there to carry it," she said. "It was no trouble," he said, and he said it with the slightest emphasis, the kind that means something more than it says, and she laughed. They moved into the ranch house in the valley at the end of February. Cade had added 2 rooms in the weeks before the wedding, working through the cold afternoons after his ranch work was done, and Willis had helped without being asked, and the result was a house that felt, from the first day Alina lived in it, like a place that had been waiting for her. She brought her mother's quilts and put them on the beds, and they looked as though they had always been there. She brought her father's Bible and put it on the bookshelf beside Cade's Shakespeare and his collection of poetry, and the shelf looked better for it. She put the daguerreotype of her parents on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, and Cade looked at it for a moment and said, "They look like people who raised someone worth knowing." And she loved him more than she had already loved him, which she had not been sure was possible. She continued teaching school. This had never been in question between them. Cade had never suggested, even implicitly, that marriage should end her work, and she had appreciated this so specifically that she had told him so, and he had looked genuinely puzzled by the idea that it could be otherwise. "You are the best teacher this county has had," he said. "Stopping would be a waste of something important." This was so practically stated, and so completely without condescension, that it was perhaps the most romantic thing he had ever said to her, which she did not explain to him, because she thought he might find it hard to believe. She rode Pearl into town 5 days a week through the rest of the school year, and the school grew. By April they had 40 children enrolled, and by May 2 new families had settled in the county specifically because they had heard there was a good school. Alina wrote to the county for additional funding, citing the enrollment figures with the precise, documented advocacy she had developed for such purposes, and received a modest increase that allowed her to order new textbooks and a proper globe. James Rourke finished the school year reading at grade level. Alina told this to Cade on a May evening on the porch of the ranch house, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thank you," in a voice that held everything he did not usually put into words, and she put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail, and they watched the light leave the valley together. Hugh Hanlon's boys Marcus and Edward demonstrated at the spring school recital that their mathematical abilities extended to calculations that Alina suspected surpassed her own, which she took as a pure and uncomplicated pleasure. Clara Reed read a passage from a poem she had found in the general store catalog at the recital, and read it so well that old Pete, who was in the audience, wiped his eye with the back of his hand, and said it was the finest thing he had heard since 1866, which, considering that he claimed to have been everywhere and heard everything, was a substantial compliment. Summer in Kansas was a different country from summer in Ohio. The heat was more absolute, more insistent, and the sky was bigger with it, a dome of hard blue above the baking prairie, and the creek ran lower in August, and the cattle moved more slowly, and the horses stood in the shade of the barn and breathed. Alina kept the school open through June, and then closed it for July and August when the heat made concentration impossible, and she used the summer to prepare materials for the following year and to begin to understand the ranch, which was a considerable education in itself. She learned from Cade and from Willis about cattle, about the rhythms of the land, about the way water moved through limestone country and why it mattered, about what the grass could support and what it could not and how to read the difference. She learned to cook on a wood stove with the seriousness of a person learning a new language, and she was not immediately skilled at this, and her first several attempts at bread were objects of charitable consumption. But Cade ate them without complaint, and Willis ate them without comment, and Senator the dog ate the failures with absolute and non-judgmental enthusiasm. And by August, her bread was good. She also learned that she was going to have a child. She told Cade on a hot August evening when the sun was going down behind the hills, and the air was beginning to cool, and the valley was in shadow, and the creek was a low, quiet sound below them. He turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen before, something unguarded and complete, something that came entirely from the center of him without any of the usual careful containment. He said nothing for a long moment. And then he said, "Eleanor," as though her name were something he needed to hold carefully. "In the spring, I think," she said. "April, perhaps." He took her hands in both of his and looked at her with that face, the one that was all of him at once. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you? Everything is all right." "Everything is perfectly all right," she said. "I am healthy and the heat has not been as difficult as I expected, and I intend to teach school until at least February, and I would appreciate your not suggesting otherwise." He almost smiled. "I would not dream of it," he said. "Good," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed them against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat, and he said, "I am," and then stopped because the word he was looking for was not in his usual vocabulary, the direct and practical vocabulary of a man who named things by what they were. He was looking for a word for what he felt, and it was too large for any of the words he had available. "I know," she said. "Yes," he said. "You always do." Word traveled through Caldwell with the speed that all significant news travels through small towns, which is to say, immediately and comprehensively. Mrs. Colton embraced Eleanor with the fervor of someone whose narrative has reached its ideal development. Sarah Rourke came out to the ranch that weekend and spent an afternoon talking about practical matters with the particular knowledge of a woman who has done this before, and Eleanor was grateful for it, because she was also a woman who took practical matters seriously and did not appreciate being left to worry about logistics. James Rourke, informed by his mother that his uncle and his teacher were going to have a baby, appeared at the school the following Monday with the expression of a child processing significant information and said, "My mother says the baby will be my cousin." "That is correct," Eleanor said. "I will be a good cousin," James said, with the seriousness of a commitment being made. "I know you will," Eleanor said. "You are a good person, James. That tends to include being a good cousin." He seemed satisfied with this and returned to his arithmetic, and Eleanor turned to the blackboard and felt the particular double happiness of loving a child she was responsible for and knowing she was going to have a child of her own. The school year of 1879 to 1880 was the fullest and most demanding year of Eleanor's life. She taught through the autumn and winter with the increasing physical complexity of pregnancy, adapting where she needed to, refusing to adapt where she did not need to, and finding that the children were largely indifferent to her changing shape in the way children are when the person in question is simply present and consistent and therefore normal. She had help. This was not something she had always accepted gracefully, but she had learned in Caldwell, in the marriage and the school and the valley, that help offered freely was not debt and was not diminishment. Cade made sure she was never without what she needed, and never made her feel managed or supervised in doing so, which was a line she had explained precisely, and which he had heard and respected with complete accuracy. Mrs. Colton came to the ranch twice a week through the winter, and cooked and gossiped, and told Eleanor things about the town that Alina had not been able to learn from her position within it, because Mrs. Colton had the particular knowledge of a woman who had been watching people for 30 years and knew what everything meant. Margaret Reed came in January and spent a long afternoon helping Alina set up what would be the baby's room, and they talked, in the warm stone room with the snow against the windows, about what it was like to build a life in a place that was still deciding whether it wanted you. Margaret had built her life in Caldwell with more resistance than Alina had faced, and she spoke of it without bitterness, but without illusion, and Alina listened with the specific attention she brought to things that mattered. "Caldwell is getting better," Margaret said. "Slowly, but it is getting better. 10 years ago Solomon could not have served on a committee with white ranchers. Now he and Cade Rourke are the two people the county actually listens to on land questions. That is not nothing." "It is not enough either," Alina said. "No," Margaret agreed. "It is not enough, but it is movement, and movement matters." She looked at Alina steadily. "Your school matters. What you do in that room matters in ways you may not see for 20 years." Alina thought about this and believed it, because she thought about the long timelines of education. The way a thing planted in a child's mind at 6 could be the root of who they became at 40, and the way a classroom that told a child they were worth teaching became part of the foundation of everything they built afterward. Her son was born on the 7th of April, 1880, in the Stone Ranch house in the valley with Margaret Reed and the county doctor present, and Cade in the next room moving around with the contained energy of a man performing stillness under considerable duress. The labor was long but not complicated, and the doctor was competent and calm, and Margaret held Alina's hand and talked to her in a voice that was low and steady and made difficult things feel survivable. The baby was healthy and large and loudly opinionated from his first moments in the world, and Alina, who had worked very hard and was extremely tired, held him against her chest and looked at the small, indignant, perfect face, and felt something she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe and never quite manage. Cade came in, and she watched him see his son for the first time. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom in the Stone Ranch house and looked at the baby, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, the thing where everything that was usually contained was not, where all of it was visible at once, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and at Alina and did not speak for a long moment. "He looks very serious," he finally said. "He has strong opinions about being born," Alina said. "He expressed them clearly." Cade reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, with the careful tenderness of a man handling something of infinite value, and the baby's hand closed around his finger with the reflexive grip of the newborn, and Cade looked at his son's hand holding his finger, and Alina watched his face and thought that she had never seen anything so beautiful in her life. "What shall we call him?" she said. They had discussed names. They had a list. But looking at him now, she waited to hear what Cade thought, because sometimes the right name only became clear when the person was actually present. "Daniel," Cade said, "after my father." "Daniel Rourke," Alina said. She tested it. "Yes." "Daniel James would give him his cousin's name as well," Cade said. "Daniel James Rourke," she said. "That is a fine name for a person who intends to be here for a long time." "He does seem to intend it," Cade said. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her carefully, not to disturb the baby, and the three of them sat in the April afternoon in the stone house in the valley and began. James Rourke came the next day with his mother and stood at the bedroom door with the particular mixture of solemnity and excitement that 9-year-olds bring to meeting new people. He looked at Daniel for a long time. "He is very small," James said. "He will get larger," Alina assured him. "I will teach him to read," James said with the air of a person making a significant offer. Alina looked at Cade over James's head and saw the same thing she was feeling on his face. "That is very generous," she said. "He will need you to teach him. You are very good at it now." James stood slightly taller. This was true, and he knew it, and it was one of the best things about him. Alina went back to teaching school in September, when Daniel was 5 months old, and had already demonstrated that he had inherited his mother's capacity for intense engagement with the things in front of him, and his father's ability to be quietly still when something required observation. He spent his days at the ranch with a woman from town named Rosa who had been recommended by every woman who knew her, and Alina rode in to school 5 days a week and thought about her son during the day with the particular quality of attention that is not worry but simply love in its daily functioning form. The school continued to grow. By the school year of 1880 to 1881, there were 53 enrolled children, and Alina wrote again to the county, and this time Cade appeared at the county seat in person to support her funding request, which he did by presenting an analysis of land values and property assessments in counties with established schools versus those without, delivered in his particular style of quiet, incontrovertible precision. And the county board approved a budget increase that allowed Alina to hire a part-time assistant, a young woman named Lucy Chen who had grown up in Alina's first class and was now 17 and had the natural gift of a born teacher. This was, Alina knew, one of the best things she had done. Not just the hiring, but the years before it, the years of telling Lucy that she was worth taking seriously, that her talent was real and valuable and could lead somewhere, the years of making the schoolroom a place where she could discover this about herself. Caldwell was still changing. The cattle drives were slowing as the railroads pushed further into Texas, and the need for the long trail north diminished, and the town was in the process of becoming something other than what it had been, which was both a loss and an opportunity. Cade saw this clearly and talked about it at the Tuesday council meetings with his usual precision, arguing for the diversification of the town's economic base, for supporting the growing farming community, for the kind of investment in schools and roads and infrastructure that turned cattle towns into places that could last when the cattle economy shifted. He was not always successful. Pryor resisted most things. But he was consistent and persuasive, and over time, which is how real change moves in small places, he moved things. The injustices Alina had seen did not disappear. Solomon Reed still navigated a county that assessed him differently than it assessed white ranchers of equivalent means. Lucy Chen still encountered men who would not look her in the eye. The children along the border whose families had deeper claims to the land than anyone with a homestead certificate faced diminishments and enclosures that the law allowed and justice did not. Alina and Cade talked about these things honestly, as they talked about most things, without pretending that living decently themselves was the same as the world being just, but also without the despair that comes from believing nothing can move. "Things are better than they were," Cade said one evening on the porch in the summer of 1881 with Daniel asleep inside and the valley dark and fragrant below them. "They are not good enough, but they are moving." "It is the slowest possible movement," Alina said. "Yes," he said, "but it is movement." "You are consistent about believing this," she said. "I find it more useful than the alternative," he said. "And I have seen things change in the 11 years I have been doing this. I was on the trail in 1870, and I am sitting on this porch in 1881, and the distance between those two places is not nothing." She looked out at the valley. Daniel James Rourke, who was 14 months old and had recently discovered that he could climb the porch rail if he timed it correctly, was fortunately asleep. "What do you want for him?" she asked. "When you think about Daniel's future," Cade was quiet for a moment. "I want him to know that what he builds is his," he said. "Not in the way of possession, but in the way of authorship. I want him to know that what he makes and what he stands for comes from him, from inside him, and that this makes it worth making." He paused. "And I want him to be able to read poetry without embarrassment." She laughed in the summer dark. "That is a wonderful aspiration." "It has served me reasonably well," he said. She leaned against his shoulder on the porch in the summer night, and felt the particular happiness that is not the happiness of exceptional moments, but the happiness of a life that has been built into something true, the happiness of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing with exactly the person they were supposed to find. James Rourke, who was now 12 and reading everything he could get hold of, who had discovered a talent for history that Alina suspected would take him to a university someday if she had anything to say about it, came to the ranch on a Saturday afternoon that fall and spent an hour attempting to teach Daniel to say his own name, with the methodical patience of a boy who had been taught that difficult things reward continued effort. Daniel said something that was approximately James, which was close enough for James to accept as complete success, and he reported this to his mother and his uncle at the supper table with the satisfaction of a teacher who has seen his student achieve something real. Cade looked at Alina across the supper table. She looked back at him. The lamplight was warm on the stone walls, and Daniel was in his high chair, considering a piece of cornbread, with the intense focus he brought to all material objects. And Senator the dog was at his usual position under the table waiting for whatever fell. And James was talking about the Roman conquest of Britain, which he had been reading about in a book Alina had ordered specially from a bookseller in Kansas City. And Sarah was passing the beans and asking Willis how the south fence was holding up. It was an ordinary evening. It was, Alina thought, the most extraordinary kind of ordinary she had ever inhabited. In December of 1882, Daniel turned 2 and began saying complete sentences with a confidence that made Willis nod approvingly and made Cade say, with the dry precision that Alina had come to love absolutely, "He gets that from his mother." In March of 1883, Alina discovered she was expecting their second child, and she told Cade on the bluff above the valley where he had carried her trunk through the rain 3 miles of his own past. And he listened and then pulled her close with both arms and held her there in the spring wind with the creek visible below them and the cottonwoods beginning to come back to leaf. And they stood like that for a long time without needing to say anything at all. Their daughter was born in October of 1883 and they named her Ruth, after no one in particular, and because the name suited her, which it did from the beginning. She was a calm, observant baby who watched the world with an attention that was entirely her own. And Daniel, who was 3 years old and had mixed feelings about the development, came around decisively when he discovered that Ruth would hold his finger with the same reflexive certainty that he had once held his father's, and he walked around for weeks announcing that he was a brother as though this were the most significant credential anyone could possess. James Rourke was 14 when Ruth was born, and he took his role as cousin with the total seriousness of a young man who had decided that he was responsible for the next generation. He had also, by this point, read every book Alina had in the ranch house and was working through the small library that Caldwell had established in the back of the general store, and Alina had begun writing letters to the University of Kansas on his behalf, because she had watched him grow from a child who struggled with reading to a young man who consumed knowledge with an appetite that no small county school could adequately feed, and she was not going to let that go unsupported. Cade knew she was writing these letters. He had said when she told him, "He will need money for it eventually. We will manage that when the time comes," and she had loved him for the we. The winter of 1883 was mild, and the spring of 1884 was generous. The kind of spring that makes people in Kansas feel that the landscape is apologizing for previous difficulties. The creek ran full and clear, and the prairie grass came in thick, and the valley below the bluff was a color of green that seemed to illuminate itself from within. And Alina rode out to the bluff one May morning with Daniel sitting in front of her on Pearl, who was aging with grace and still had excellent manners, and Ruth on Cade's horse in front of him, and they stood on the bluff above their valley and looked at everything they had made. The ranch house was larger now, extended twice over the years, with a proper kitchen and a study where Alina did her school preparation and Cade did his accounting, and they both read in the evenings in the companionable silence of two people who have discovered that shared silence is its own form of conversation. The barn had been rebuilt after a partial collapse 2 winters before, better than before, because everything they rebuilt was better than before. There were 12 more cattle than there had been last year. The garden Alina had planted along the south wall of the house was in its 3rd year and producing with the reliable abundance of something that has gotten itself established. "Do you remember what you thought when you first saw this valley?" Cade asked. "I remember thinking it looked permanent," she said, "like it intended to be here for a long time. And now?" She looked at the stone house below them, at the smoke from the morning fire still rising from the chimney, at the barn and the garden and the cottonwoods along the creek in their May green. She thought about Daniel in front of her asking questions she could not answer quickly enough. She thought about Ruth's calm, particular gaze on the world she was learning. She thought about James Rourke reading Roman history in the lamplight of this house and saying, with the simple certainty of a 12-year-old, that someday he wanted to teach people things, and about how Alina had looked at him and thought, good. She thought about 42 children who had needed a teacher, and about Lucy Chen, who was now 21 and teaching in the school alongside Alina with the gifts of a natural educator. She thought about the trunk that Cade had carried through the rain, all of her mother's quilts and her father's Bible and her teaching certificates, and the daguerreotype. All of it arrived safely. All of it spread through this house and this life until it was no longer separate things carried carefully but simply the texture of everything. She thought about 3 miles of rain and gray-green eyes and a man who picked up the trunk without being asked because it was there and it needed to be carried and he had decided to carry it, and then said it was no trouble at all, meaning it. "Now it is mine," she said. "Ours." "Yes," he said. He shifted Ruth against him, and the baby made a sound of mild commentary. "That is exactly right." Below them in the valley, Senator the dog, ancient now and largely gray, was moving along the creek bank with the slow dignity of a creature who had lived long enough to take the world at his own pace. Willis was coming out of the barn. The morning light was doing what morning light does in Kansas in May when everything is right, filling the valley from the east with something that made the ordinary landscape of their lives look like a painting of itself, like something that understood its own value. Daniel pressed back against Alina and pointed at something in the valley below, a bird or a light or something only 3-year-olds can see, and said, with the absolute conviction of a small person whose world is entirely present and entirely wonderful, "Look, Mama, look at that." She looked. She looked at the valley and the creek and the stone house and the garden and the cottonwoods and the old dog and the faithful man beside her and the 2 children they had made and the years they had built and the life that had been waiting at the end of 3 miles of rain. She looked at all of it. "I see it," she said. "I see every bit of it." Cade reached across and found her hand where it rested on the horse's neck, and he held it without saying anything, in the way he sometimes said the most important things, and the spring morning opened around them with the uncomplicated generosity of a world that had, in this particular valley, on this particular morning, gotten something exactly right. They rode down from the bluff and into their life, and the valley received them, and the house was warm, and Senator raised his gray head from the creek bank and wagged his tail once with the measured enthusiasm of a very old dog who has seen good things before and knows them when they arrive. And Willis nodded from the barn doorway in the way that meant everything was well. And Ruth grabbed Cade's shirt with one small determined fist and held on. And Daniel said something important about the bird he had seen. And Alina listened to all of it, every word of it, with her whole heart. She had come to Caldwell in the rain with her trunk and her teaching certificates, and her McGuffey readers and her father's Bible and her mother's quilts, and the daguerreotype of 2 people who had loved each other, until there was nothing left to love. And she had found a man who carried things because they needed to be carried and asked for nothing, and said it was no trouble when he meant it. And she had found 42 children and then 53 children, and then more. And she had found a valley and a school and a life with a stone foundation, and room enough for everything she had brought with her, and everything she had found here, and everything that was still to come. It had been, from the very first rain-soaked mile, no trouble at all. And it had been, from the very last quiet morning on the bluff above the valley, everything.